Good day, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on which part of the world you're coming from. My name is Shamila Subramani, the Chief Sustainability Officer for the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. It is my absolute honor and pleasure to be with you today, moderating this panel of really illustrious speakers from around the continent of Africa, a continent that is going to play a huge part in the future growth prospects of the world. This panel on planting the seeds for a climate resilient Africa is one I'm sure that you're going to find to be quite interesting. And we're looking at the intersection of women, youth, and a number of different things that we will need to do and look at in order to really achieve this mission of developing a climate resilient Africa. And before we proceed and I introduce to you our really illustrious panel, I would like to pause for a minute and reflect on the entire issue that we're facing as a globe, which is the issue of racism and the move to anti-racism, which once again has reared its ugly head in the form of what we're seeing as racist attacks in the US. But of course, it's just one example of what we're seeing as inequality that is perpetuated throughout the globe. It couldn't be a more appropriate day today. Today is the 16th of June, and it is also the 44th year of the commemoration of the Soweto uprisings here in South Africa. It is a public holiday, and I'm coming to you from Johannesburg, where it's icy cold, it's rainy, it's wintry weather. And for the first time in decades, where normally we will commemorate a day like this with rallies and mass gatherings, understanding the issues that we're here to try and alleviate and eliminate, in fact, from our society, it is silent because of lockdown due to the COVID pandemic. So many things resonate with the issues that we face today. And when I look outside, it's almost as if the heavens are saying to us with the weather and the somber mood that this is something we seriously need to reflect on. So I would like to say that we at the Stock Exchange really stand with the Black Lives Matter movement and commit to stepping up our efforts to combat racism. Our CEO, Dr. Leila Fourie, has recently taken a grassroots stand on this issue, going back to having simple conversations with people within our company and outside to understand again why it is that we're still facing these issues so many years on from the significant movement where we've seen over 500 youth lose their lives as they protested the apartheid movement and the Bantu education system. So with that somber note, I think it's good for us to turn to a more positive view today when we're really blessed to have such a panel that will speak to us about the many issues that we can tackle as a continent and the many opportunities that lie on the road ahead of us. So with that, I'd like to introduce to you today the panel, beginning with Her Excellency Dr. Yasmin Fuad, who is the Minister of Environment of the Arab Republic of Egypt, many years across academia, civil society, and government, and huge experience that she will share for us today, including being the focal point in Egypt for the Global Climate Facility. We also have Dr. Jackie Mkindi, who is the CEO of the Tanzanian Horticultural Association, huge experience, highly decorated, and really looking at the issues of agriculture and what that means in a completely different way to what we would traditionally expect. We then have Mr. Raoul Goufflet, who is the Deputy CEO of the Mauritius Commercial Bank, huge experience in the banking industry, particularly in the debt capital markets and across a number of different areas, really going to be talking to us today about the fundamentals about how the financial system can help in alleviating these issues that we're facing and in really trying to build this climate resilient Africa. We then have none other than Ms. Rebecca Miano, the CEO of KenGen. KenGen, of course, is Kenya's largest power utility and it provides 75% of Kenya's energy, but further also supplies power into other parts of the continent and is really a leader in renewable energy. And I think we are really honored to have you today, Ms. Miano. We are also joined by Ms. Joyce Msuya, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the United Nations Environmental Program. Joyce comes to us also with a huge amount of experience, including many years at the World Bank, and that experience spans continents across Asia, Africa, and the Northern Hemisphere. So thank you very much to everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here today, and I'm sure that our audience can't wait to hear further from you. So with that, I think I'd like to pose our first question to Ms. Fuad, who is to Her Excellency. You are the president of the African Ministerial Conference on Environmental Conference on the Environment. And this has really grown to become a central forum for environmental policy making on the continent of Africa. Could you please share with us a little bit of the insights you've gained during this time on how governments are mobilizing and working collaboratively to implement new policies at the national and regional levels and accelerating low carbon sustainable development across Africa? We're hoping you could share with us some of the concrete examples that you've seen and perhaps some successful policy implementation tools that you are particularly relevant in our conversation today. Please, Your Excellency. Oh, is Dr. Ford not with us? Okay. Thank you. All right, as Dr. Ford is not with us, so I'm going to then maybe move across perhaps to Jackie Mkindi from the Tanzania Horticultural Association. Just double checking if Jackie's with us and can hear fine. Jackie? Okay. Okay, well then I think I'm going to move to Rebecca Miano from Kengen. So Rebecca, I think the Kenyan example is such a sterling one, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more. If we look at the energy resources on the African continent, these are considerable and they are diverse. We're a continent of abundant sunshine and many natural resources. However, despite many of these resources, there are so many countries across the continent that remain constrained by low energy access and consumption, and what we generally refer to as energy poverty. We know that access to reliable energy is necessary for private sector development, and of course, that contributes to economic development, which we know is necessary to grow and to improve equality across. However, we also recognize that clean energy and renewable resources play a key role in that path to sustainable development. So, in your view, I mean, how is Kengen driving this low carbon development on the continent, and particularly with regards to improving energy access through low cost and low polluting technologies? Please, if you could share with us, Ms. Miano.
Indeed, the African continent is endowed with considerable energy sources. The continent's potential in renewable energy is estimated at 10 terawatts of solar, 350 gigawatts of hydroelectric, 110 gigawatts of wind, and more than 20 gigawatts of geothermal. And therefore, by default, Africa is the renewable energy continent, and we can claim that title. However, AFDB estimates that electricity access in Africa is at only 40%, with a whopping 645 million people with no access to electricity. And the annual power consumption per capita in sub-Saharan Africa is actually the lowest in the world. But when we come to Kengen, as you have said, Kengen is the largest electricity producer in Kenya, supplying over 75% of the annual consumption. And the good news is, over 80% of the electricity generated in Kenya is renewable. And we quickly relate to SDG 7. Our strategy is also to increase generation in the next few years only from renewable sources, especially geothermal, which is a resource that is freely and generously available in the Great Rift Valley. And it is also the lowest in terms of the tariff. We have capacity in geothermal technologies, and this has made our country the 7th in the world in terms of development of geothermal. And Kengen is driving low carbon development, not only in Kenya, but supporting countries in the region in developing their geothermal resources. The renewable energy source, we can say, are much quicker to install. They create employment, reduce global warming. They improve the health of the people because you don't use the harmful sources of power. And this also reduces mortality rate, carbon emissions are reduced, and this generally enhances socio-economic transformation. And in Kenya, we are glad that the access is now about 75%. There is a vision to have universal access by 2022, but that may be delayed by COVID crisis, but the vision is still there. So we are doing a lot of collaboration even in the region. And even as we start, I want to say that Africa needs to plant the seeds of renewable energy for a climate resilient continent. I also want to recognize that today, 16th of June, is the Day of the African Child. And what a great day to discuss renewable energy.
Thank you very, very much for that, Ms. Miano. I think it's such a story of inspiration and I think really aspiration for what is possible when you apply your mind. And thank you for sharing those practical examples. And Patel, you'll share with us a little bit about the relative cost of producing that and examples that you could maybe.
Well, it seems we've lost. I'm taking over if you want. It seems we've lost Shamila, and I think she started talking about the cost to fund climate adaptation in Africa and the fact that they are huge. And one of the questions that she wanted to address with me was relating to the estimated needs of about 5 to 10 billion a year that investors would be able to fund low carbon and climate resilient development in Africa. And one of the questions that she wanted to ask and share with the panel and the audience is about the cause of low level of funding and investment for low carbon development in Africa, and what are companies like the Mauritius Commercial Bank doing to address this. So if you allow me, I will anticipate a question, and I will start by giving some background about MCB. MCB is a commercial bank and is part of the MCB Group, which is an integrated banking and financial services player, which is established in the Republic of Mauritius since 1838, so about 180 years ago. The group is diversified and is now involved in capital markets, leasing, factoring, consulting, to name a few. But what is important is that we initiated our regional diversification in the 90s, and we now have subsidiaries in many small island states, which is going to be pertinent in talking about sustainable development. We have a presence in Madagascar, Seychelles, and Maldives, and we do, of course, business in many African countries. When we talk about sustainability and more precisely climate change, indeed these are very topical for the African continent. In October, we undertook a survey on the occasion of our 10th Africa Forward Together conference that united about 35 bank CEOs and senior executives from African countries. They all highlighted that sustainability was one of the most important concerns for them. But what was important also to note is that many deemed that the African market for green financing was very immature, with products and services which were not adapted. Yet, we believe that they all believe that green finance products were increasingly popular worldwide, and this was indeed confirmed by the rising number of volumes of green bonds and green loans that have been issued in 2019. So why is the transition to low-carbon Africa a complex matter? And I think African countries are on the front lines of intensifying climate change risk through the continent, and they have contributed to leads at least to global warming. Yet, it's already experiencing a lot of devastating impacts from the frequency and length of climate change. You all see that in Africa, there's all events like drought, floods, sea rise level, which result in very extreme costly losses in agriculture and livestock, water supply, hydropower generation disruptions. And these in time will become major social, economic, and national security issues. There are various reasons that can explain the low level of funding and investment towards a low-carbon economy in Africa. One of them is that climate change is often seen as only an environmental issue rather than a developmental issue. Worse, the extent and damage to come resulting from climate change is very often minimized. People wrongly talk about the climate crisis, whereas we believe that we would better talk about climate transformation. A crisis like the one we've just seen is something temporary. It's an event that disrupts the flow of things, positively or negatively. But on the other hand, the transformation is a slow, irreversible change. And our climate is changing, and we will have to adapt. And there is no way of going back, hence the urgency of tackling both mitigation and adaptation measures via appropriate investment. So most countries, and especially in Africa, need to treat climate change as a development issue and systematically address it in their development strategies and policies, so that they can promote low-carbon development, resource use efficiently, and build resilience. And this is where I think those investment plans, projects that are created with the support of development partners, not just the UN, but should be based on countries' climate commitments and nationally determined contribution, which is in line with the Paris Agreement. But what I wanted to address more importantly is that African governments should also be looking into those new climate finance approaches that can raise capital and drive down all the mitigation costs by harnessing the capacity of the private sector to compete, to deliver those climate investments. And public-private synergy, which we are trying in Mauritius as a bank with the government to promote, is essential to accelerate the funding of those climate-resilient projects. I take an example. Pure commercial banks don't have the funding structures and resources to enter what they would believe are not so profitable markets for the time being. Obviously, because of the risk and compliance strains and the generally low-level development of renewable energies on the continent. As an example, MCB, we organized a climate conference, which we call in Creole Clima with a K, with an objective to mobilize the public sector and corporates on the urgency of climate change. Mauritius is ranked the 7th country most exposed to natural hazards and the 13th country in the world with high disaster risk by the World Risk Report. Sorry? Okay. And if you allow me to finish, so we presented, with the help of a sustainability consulting firm, a report that highlights the path to low-carbon economy, so that it is not a constraint but an opportunity. And we announced various climate engagements, like the one that we will not more finance new thermal coal project power plants, and we dedicated a significant budget over the next 3 years to finance eligible projects that will transform the country to a carbon-neutral economy. So by committing to transform countries an integrated climate risk assessment in financing portfolio, I think this is how financial institutions would actually make sure that we tackle this important matter of the funding of low carbon development in Africa.
Thank you very much, Raoul. I think that answered so many of the really pertinent and burning issues that we have, and you've covered so adequately some really good pointers on things like what is the cause of the low levels of funding, and you've pointed to the appetite for risk amongst commercial banks and traditional funding structures. You've looked at compliance constraints and those sorts of issues, but I think what was particularly pertinent and perhaps a good takeaway from the audience is this issue of risk and the risk that's aligned to that, and such a practical example of how one could make policy statements and policy changes as a bank in your investment portfolios to be able to be aligned with the Paris Agreement and hence reach the sort of the net zero target that we're looking at by 2050. So thank you so much for that, Raoul. Apologies to the audience for the number of technical issues we seem to be having. But with that, I think I would really like to turn to Her Excellency Dr. Yasmin Fuad, the Minister of Environment for the Arab Republic of Egypt. Minister, are you there? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you very well. Hello, everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you. So the Minister and I are sitting on opposite ends of the continent this morning. So Excellency, you're the President of the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment, and this has grown to become a central platform and a forum for environmental policy making on the continent. So could you share with us a little bit, firstly, about how governments are mobilizing and working collaboratively to implement new policies at the national and regional levels to accelerate this low carbon and sustainable development transition that we need to see across the continent? And if you could, it would be great if you could share with us some concrete examples, perhaps, of successful policy implementation and policy harmonization. I think Raoul has just reflected on the sort of policy decision at a bank level in relation to financing, but of course the macro policy at more national levels and perhaps even regional levels is critically important. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you much. First of all, it's my pleasure really to be here today in this session on planting the seeds for a climate resilient Africa. It's a very long journey that Africa has passed through. In our capacity as being the previous AMSN leader and CAHOSC leader, 2015 has really marked a milestone in Africa calendar and in Africa journey throughout development. In that year, it was not also the Paris Agreement that came to birth, but also two very important initiatives that came to birth as a concrete request from Africa to the world as being one of the most vulnerable continents to the impact of climate change. The first one was the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative. As we all know, that there is a huge gap for access to energy in Africa, and that hinders the development, the sustainable development processes and the development processes of our continent. So without access to energy, there will be very little movement, very little work that is being done in that beautiful continent with its vast resources. The second one was the Africa Adaptation Initiative. And why I'm saying that those are two landmarks and two important benchmarks, because those are the two very concrete examples for mitigation and adaptation as to face the fight against climate change. It was not only through Egypt as being the AMSN and the CAHOSC leader that the birth for those two initiatives came very concrete with the request for the sufficient financial resources that should be available to support Africa to overcome the challenge of climate change, being the less contributing to that, but also the most affected continent. But also the journey was completed as well in 2018 with the Conference of the Party for the Convention on Biological Diversity. And I would like also to stress a very important point here when we're talking about policy harmonization. We cannot select actually between climate change and loss of biodiversity. And every time we go into a session or a meeting, we do have those kinds of distinguish between what we call climate resilience, and we start that talk of climate change and the low carbon economies and so forth. And then we have another venue where we are discussing the ecosystem restriction and the loss of the biodiversity. This should not be the case. Policy harmonization is to be met in Africa. It has to be met first among us leaders, as ministers, as those from developed and developing countries. We cannot detach the discussion of the loss of biodiversity, the degradation of the land, and the fight against climate change from each other. The three Rio conventions were born together, and we willingly detached them. So this is the first we need to start looking at about what kind of policy harmonization can be done at the level of the continent. Different examples came from different projects. When we're talking about a project that looks at the land degradation in Africa, the watershed management project in Eastern Africa, when we're talking about the ecosystem restoration, these are examples where we are harnessing between the land, the efficient use of the water, how better to adapt, and how can we include a sustainable livelihood approach for the local communities. Those are examples that we need to replicate and upscale. So moving from the political level of spelling out needs for Africa with both mitigation and adaptation, having a pan-African agenda coming out from the CBD COP14 and mobilizing the stakeholders to talk within that and making of synergies clear until we go into the level of implementing the project that with more of an added value in many ways. Finally, Egypt has supported the whole continent, and especially Africa, in announcing the initiative for ecosystem restoration, for linking once again the biodiversity, the land degradation, and the climate change. Out of that came the cross-cutting JAF program that is available for the vulnerable countries, especially the LDCs and the SEDs, linking the the three areas together and coming up with projects into that. The IUCN had followed that small projects of the local communities, and these are all concrete examples of what can be done at the global era. How can we do it in Africa with the policy coordination? What kind of initiatives do we need to keep pushing and keeping the momentum going on until we reach two concrete projects at the ground? Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Yeah, there was such a helpful set of examples, but I think also just reiterating for us that whenever we're having conversations on developing climate resilience, that this cannot be decoupled from the issue of biodiversity and the preservation of biodiversity, which of course is such a critical part of the natural capital of the continent. And I think that offers a really, really great segue for me to please bring in Dr. Jackie Mkindi, the CEO of the Tanzania Horticultural Association. And Jackie, of course, on your side, the question to you really is that agriculture is such a major economic driver, and of course linked to this issue of biodiversity and how we preserve it. Of course, within agriculture, there are a number of complexities too, as to how do we develop climate-smart agriculture versus the type of agriculture that we have come to see now in typical terms sometimes is actually quite degrading to the environment. So if we look at that, I mean, let's look at agriculture as a major economic driver in Africa, and the fact that it is key to poverty alleviation, food security, and decent work and employment for millions of Africans. But it's still home to more than 200 million undernourished people. So if we recognize that agriculture, horticulture, forestry, and other land use sectors are the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Africa, this produces a bit of a problem. And how can we work then with perhaps smallholder farmers, agribusiness, and governments to achieve a win-win situation where we can dramatically increase agricultural productivity, but ensure that there is resilience in those farming systems through lower emissions process and preserve this really critical natural capital for our continent. Please, Dr. Jackie.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shayla, and it's an opportunity for me to be invited. Thank you very much for inviting me to this powerful presentation or discussion. It is true that agriculture is a major driver for our country's economic transformation, but also a driver towards attaining, the industrialization agenda in Africa, and also a driver towards attaining the food security and food nutrition targets as set by our countries. And there are commendable efforts and commitments by our governments, our African government, but also commitment by the private sector in Africa, including farmers, and also our development partners. There has been millions of dollars invested in agriculture But African agriculture is still vulnerable and faced with a number of challenges, including the global climate change, floods, too high or too low temperatures, infrastructural current impact of the COVID-19. Yeah. So, and of course, despite huge opportunities in Africa, but still we are importing, and our import bill now is at US dollar 35 billion per year. And Tanzania is not exceptional. Our import bill is about, US dollar 500 million. And if we do not do something now, something active now, then our import bill might actually increase to more than 110 billion US dollar per year. So what should we do as African countries? To improve farmers' productivity actually takes a multi-pronged approach involving an array of stakeholders to achieve sustainable improvement in productivity. So we really have the approach that we should actually implement must be driven by opportunity to farmers and income, opportunities to farmer and income, and this is market access. So our approach and our mechanism must be centered around market access, as we place smallholder farmers at the center of it all, while we actually ensure that there is a win-win relationship between our smallholder farmers and other actors across the value chain. And this is very critical to attain the level of sustainability that we require in our food production system. So proper strategies to actually unlock market opportunities and market potential in African countries is very, very critical, as there is a very direct link between market access and productivity. And when we talk of market access, there is huge business or trade opportunities amongst African countries. African governments and policymakers must appreciate the need for cross-border trade, for example, as a driver towards African agriculture transformation. There is huge opportunity in food commodity trade in Africa, and African countries, including farmers, can earn a lot in trading food across or amongst ourselves than even, from traditional export commodities. So that is very, very important. And so this is a wake-up call to all of us, the private sector and the government, to actually implement affirmative actions that will promote regional food trade and avoid cross-border restrictions when it comes to food trading amongst ourselves. Another very important aspect is access to technology and import. So this entails the use of resources that are used in production. That include fertilizers, seeds, pesticide and equipment. Many farmers in Africa still lack access to modern technologies and modern seeds, something that undermine their capacity to attain the right levels of productivity. So to attain farm productivity, three key things are important. One is, of course, genetic makeup, and that is quality seed, nutrition, that is fertilizer, and management, that is good agricultural practices that include also pest and disease management. So public-private sector must together as true partners to create enabling environment that would facilitate, accessibility, but also availability and affordability of agriculture technologies as well as agriculture import. We should be able, as partners, to and formulate policies and regulatory framework that are pro-agriculture investment, and then have the right capacity at the country to actually enforce such policies as tools to facilitate investment in agriculture technologies and innovation. So when I talk of enabling environment, it is true. It is important also to notice that it's not all about policy, legal framework and regulation, but also it is important that we implement actions that would allow access to patient capital, that is access to loans with affordable terms to smallholder farmers, availability of land, as well as institutional capacity to generate skilled labor force is also very, very critical. So those are some of the critical factors that our countries should actually consider to boost productivity amongst smallholder farmers. Another very important agenda is on capacity building. So it is also important as African countries to enhance our public and private extension system. And this is very important that, we are able to drive the right capacity to our smallholder farmers to attain the levels of production and productivity that would allow them to service the readily available market at the domestic, but also at the regional and international levels.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Mkindi. I think, when you state it out so articulately, it sounds so simple. As if we know these issues, these are typical way in which you would actually tackle something in relation to business and market access. And yet for some reason we find this so difficult. But I think I'd just like to recap on those such resounding points that you made, particularly around accessibility in relation to technology, and then of course the capacity support. The one that resonates most strongly perhaps is this issue of creating access to markets. And that of course is critical for any business that wishes to thrive and to flourish. And of course, this is something I think we need to really try to speed up on the continent, is that access to markets. Dr. Mkindi, I know we didn't really touch on this before, but can I please ask your opinion on the issue on the other side of the coin, which is the issue of food wastage? Do you by any chance have any view on what that looks like on a continent like ours? Because often that's a big issue with the food production system. If you have a view and you'd like to share that, please, at all.
Yeah, I think our efforts to boost productivity and our commitment as public and private sector to ensure that what we produce is also accessing a reliable and profitable market should go hand in hand by creating enabling environment so that our farmers can also access, innovations and technology that will enable them, store food, and reduce post-harvest losses. So again, access to innovation, access to technology, but also building capacity of our producers, building capacity of our processors at different levels so that they are able to actually comply to good agricultural practices, but also comply to market standards that would allow them, yes, produce quality food, but also take good care of what they have produced so that it can get to the market in its right freshness and right quality. So it goes all along with capacity building of our people on the ground. And we are not only talking of smallholder farmers, but we are talking of actors across the value chain. And again, ensuring that there is enabling environment for them to access innovations and technologies that will help them preserve food, but also make sure that we are increasing the shelf life of what we have produced, food.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Mkindi. And again, re-emphasizing this issue of technology, access to technology, and being able to understand that full view from sort of production crop to mouth sort of view, and I think that's so helpful. I'm going to quickly switch over then and hand the mic to Joyce Msuya, the Deputy Executive Director of the United Nations Environmental Program. So Joyce, a question posed to you is that climate change means Africa faces multiple threats on top of the ongoing threat and the destabilization that COVID is presenting us with. And in the recovery period, I think it's become more and more clear that low carbon development will be the key to ensuring ensuring long-term resiliency for African economies. However, we'd really like to ask you to reflect on what some of the concrete measures are that will need to take place in Africa in order to support this transition to an inclusive green economy and perhaps how UNEP is supporting that. Over to you, please, Joyce.
Thank you very much, Shamila, and thank you for inviting the United Nations Environment Programme. I'm very delighted to be here, and I want to just echo, Shamila, your opening remarks on this special day, but also the historical context we're living in. So before I share three very concrete measures where we see Africa could actually play a lead as part of the recovery, let me also reflect and remind amongst us the kind of leadership that we have seen pre-COVID. And I want to really thank Minister Yasmin because she symbolizes the kind of leadership that is possible in the continent. Currently, if you look on the climate ambition, 50 out of the 54 countries in Africa have actually ratified their climate action commitments, the nationally determined contributions. This is about 90% ratification rate in the continent. If you look at the banning of uses of plastic bags, Africa again takes the lead. We have more than a dozen countries that have some type of a law or actually law and enforcement when it comes to banning plastic bags. But also when it comes to carbon emission, Africa as a continent is a negligible emitter. It accounts for about 2 to 3% of the total global emissions, but yet it is a continent with poverty, with inequality, that suffers and much more vulnerable when it comes to the impact of climate change. From the economic perspective, estimates of environmental degradation alone costs Africa about $68 billion per year. So why these factors? What are the concrete measures that are linked to the factors and the facts that I've just explained? One, the post-pandemic recovery provides Africa with a real opportunity to exert the same type of leadership that we have seen in NDCs in actually not walking back from the climate ambitions. We do recognize and we stand in solidarity with our member states, with governments. Currently, this is a humanitarian issue, and we're working with other UN agencies to support the governments. But one concrete measure is the political will and leadership not to turn back on the climate commitments, on the initiatives that Minister Yasmin actually alluded to, which date back to 2015. The second concrete measure, we're seeing a number of stimulus packages as part of stimulating the economic recovery sessions. There is an opportunity here, after looking at the humanitarian side, to actually look at how Africa can build back better within the context of the green economy. How can the governments, for example, create a conducive regulatory environment, working with the private sector to create green jobs? So the stimulus package, the new money, provides an opportunity to look at the rebuilding back better and in a much more sustainable manner. The third is partnerships. We've heard from the banks, from the private sector, from the parastatals, from Honorable Minister who is here, that government action alone is not sufficient given the enormity of the challenge, especially for the 54 countries in Africa. So the partnerships with the private access, the market access to different types of innovative financing, the job creation, the technology transformation opportunities after the pandemic would require strong collective actions. Now, you asked, what is UNEP to support these measures? We're doing three things. One is, it's very clear that the pandemic will see quite a huge generation of waste, including medical waste. This have the potential of actually ruining the environment. We are working with the World Health Organization to actually look at ways to reduce and manage waste in a very sustainable way. The second is supporting in this current phase, for example, providing very specific country support in, for example, here in Kenya, in providing the personal preventive equipment as part of the fighting against the pandemic. But also we're looking forward after the humanitarian crisis to look at how can we support our member states in building back better? How can we provide the science to help inform the policy options of green economic recovery? The third is nature. We're doing studies to look at the connection between zoonotic diseases such as the COVID-19 with nature in the spirit of actually helping to improve human health in the future. A cross-cutting dimension of our work at the moment when we are all working from home is advocacy. So we are offering quite a number of webinars on waste management. We are providing our technical experts to provide technical advice to national and subnational governments. I'll stop here. Shamila, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joyce. I think, sure, that was really, really helpful. And I think so many reflection points for us there. But I think perhaps the key takeaway being when we're looking at using these stimulus packages, of which, you know, there's $1 trillion that are flowing, and that we expect that much more is still going to come in the next few months at least. And if you look at the debt levels rising as well, I think the opportunity is there to say, how can we use this to build back better? And the immediate connection to the SDGs and achieving those to actually try to remedy some of those what we know are structural deficits that we have, and that we would have been already in a better position to deal with the pandemic if we actually had achieved some of those things already. The issue that you've mentioned about looking at that connection between zoonotic diseases and nature, I think is so critical that UNEP is helping understand that in the scientific and the epidemiological basis for these things, because we're already hearing that one can expect more pandemics to come in future. And I reflect on the World Economic Forum's risk report that comes out every year. When you look at some of the top 5 challenges, I think this year for the first year, the top 5 were all environmental in nature. And so while we're talking about these issues, let's just take a step back and look at the global risks that are faced. So the work that UNEP is doing is particularly interesting. I'd like to then, take a quick go to Ms. Miano from Kenya up, and it's very much linked to the same question that I want to pose to Miano. We also have a question from the audience, which I think is quite interesting. And she says, what is your comment on exploring other sources of electric energy, such as garbage, other than geothermal, HEP, wind and solar energy? So I think, Rebecca, to you, we know that Kenyan is relying on various sources to generate electricity, ranging from hydro to wind. And so you are one of the leading energy producers, but perhaps lecture us on looking at some of these other sources, if you have a comment at all.
So this question relates directly to access to electricity and the priority that African countries will have, even in fulfilling the other SDGs. It would look like SDG 1, SDG 2, SDG 3, that is poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, would rank very high. And these SDGs were actually brought up for Africa. But post-COVID-19, these realities are going to be even more urgent. But I want to submit that SDG 7 about energy, and especially renewable energy, should rank very, very high. We should ensure that in Africa, electricity access is no longer a luxury, but a right. And my dream, as I sit here in the energy sector, is that Africa will from now on draw a line on the sand and say, never again should we have such a situation that we will not have electricity access to all our people. And the COVID-19 has brought new reality that working towards a clean environment and specifically using clean energy is no longer negotiable. And new businesses now need to develop products and services that reduce environmental pollution. We have seen reduced travel, we have seen cleaner environments that have been forced on us by COVID, but that's how we should live in the future. And as Kenyan, we are really contributing to this. We have set aside opportunities to the disadvantaged groups in our country, to the women, to the youth, and even people living with disabilities. We have set aside business opportunities in terms of procurement, and we are really leading in that so that we have equality. Africa is a continent for the youth, and we must include them even in development of renewable energy. And to the question on renewable energy, we really support any source of energy that is renewable. So we'll go to solar, the wind, the geothermal we talked about, and also biomass. Anything renewable should be brought and supported in Africa, so that as we move forward, this continent will be a showcase of what renewable energy can be and what it can do. And if we have enough access to electricity, I want to submit that all these other issues and challenges will be mitigated. There will be more opportunities. We'll see women going about their business with more ease. We will see access to education just going up, and this continent will be a better place to live in. And therefore, I really urge those in decision-making positions to prioritize access to electricity in this country, and not only access to electricity, but production of renewable energy. And the private sector should come in to support these initiatives, provide the funding that is required, of course, with a decent return on investment. We have seen that a lot of manufacturing for renewable energy production is done outside Africa, which then delays the installation of the power plants. But this, if the private sector brings manufacturing back to Africa, we'll see increased opportunities, and it will also be faster to manufacture these components that are required for power production. And governments should also ease the doing of business by private sector by creating good and easier operating environments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. You know, if that was a master class on what we needed to do, I think you've never heard it more eloquently put. And I'm actually going to ask the speakers to please round up with a minute each of concluding remarks. And Rebecca, I don't think we need to ask you to do concluding remarks. I think that was really a statement. And just to recap on what you've talked about, the promote energy and the direct link to issues of equality, to women, to youth, and to really structurally changing some of these issues just by access to energy. We hear very clear clarion call to governments and policymakers to prioritize the issue of energy and energy access, and within that, renewable energy, and of course, the call to bring more manufacturing back into Africa as a base. And with that, I think I'd like to hand the mic to Her Excellency Dr. Fuad to please make her 1 minute concluding remarks, and then we'll go to the other speakers.
Thank you very much. I believe that session is really very useful. The most important is focus on the future generation linked to the natural resources management. Without a generation that is aware, well-educated, capable, participating, and fully engaged in the natural resources management, we will not be able to really plead for a climate resilient Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Fuad. And I think there, at a point that we perhaps didn't touch on at that level, but I think that was implicit, was this issue of educating the youth in relation to climate change resilience and actually reorienting the mindset to what is possible in a greener economy. And thank you for that, Dr. Fuad. Raul, may I turn to you for your concluding remarks, please?
Yes, quickly, and thank you very much, Amida. I think we all agree that now, as we speak today, ESG is a must, and it creates a virtuous circle for all stakeholders. Talking about now investment, most companies, asset managers, investors actually look at companies differently, and it is clear that post-COVID, we should see the sustainability as an opportunity to ensure a more inclusive recovery, because and those companies who are going to succeed are the ones who are going to link purpose with profit. Those companies who within their mission statement will actually be able to demonstrate that they have a cause. And I think sustainability is a good cause. But again, this endeavor, and we talked about it, has to be a collective one. We talked about the synergistic approach that we should have between all the stakeholders around this ecosystem. But one thing you mentioned briefly, and I would like to talk about it quickly. Again, it's education, it's expertise. Green finance is a complex mix of developmental engineering, sustainability, finance skills, and African countries should engage quickly into higher education in these highly technical fields to equip the next generation with all the skills they need to implement this transition to a low carbon and climate resilient Africa. Because if we don't do that, there are so many green taxonomies and so diverse, numerous ways to look at the taxonomy of what we do in the green space. Africa should actually be able to define its own regional taxonomy for green assets and take into consideration its very specificities. And then it would probably be good for investors who would look at it from a much easier perspective to invest into the African continent.
Okay. Thank you so much for that, Raul. I mean, it's such a topic that we could carry on, but in the interest of time, I'm going to quickly ask Joyce for your closing remarks. Joyce, of course, UNEP FI, directly related to what Raul is saying, but maybe you could give us your closing comment.
Yes, I would absolutely agree with Raul. Closing comments, three words. I think one is innovation, including on innovative finance. UNEP FI is one classic example where we mobilize resources and using standards to actually bring in the private sector, working with multilaterals to support the governments. I think the second and I've heard is around access to finance, to infrastructure, to technology, and lastly, partnership, that everybody has a role to play. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And with that, I think, unfortunately, we've got maybe 30 seconds, but Dr. Mkindi, I have to let you have the last say.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shamila. I think I will agree with others that transforming agriculture and building Africa requires very strong partnership between the public and the private sector. And, the transformation must be driven by the private sector, must be led by the private sector and enabled by the government. But we really need to work together to see the real transformation that we want to see on the ground.
Thank you very much, and that's all we have time for. We could go on, I think, for the entire day. I would like to say a huge thank you to my esteemed panelists for sharing your time with us today and really giving us an education in 40 minutes on what we could do across the continent. My key takeaways: lead with energy. The leaders are massive. Renewable energy is the way forward for us. Education of the youth in new systems thinking and the new types of economy and new skill sets on innovative finance and the like is absolutely critical. And of course, Africa has the huge opportunity to lead in this transition, and we already have fantastic examples. I wish you good day and greetings from the southern tip of Africa here in Joburg, and all the best for the rest of the sessions. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our regional office and local networks in Africa for that enlightening contribution. I'm Dan Thomas in New York, and you're watching the UN Global Compact 20th Anniversary Leader Summit. It's now my great privilege and honour to hand over to our Francophone colleagues in Europe and Africa to discuss en français what can be done to support SMEs in recovering better, stronger and together.